Conversations across time. Oh.
Yeah.
All right. Conversations across time. 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 Conversations across time.
Good evening. Welcome to part 3 of our series on China. And the title of this series is China from Poverty to Power. I want, first of all, our guests tonight will introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. I was president from 1901 to 1909. I was a progressive Republican domestically, very progressive. But as far as foreign affairs was concerned, I dealt with foreign affairs with a very, very strong hand. I saw China in a very different perspective, the China of today, and I think we'll discuss that as we go further. Thanks for introducing me. I'm glad to be here.
I'm Richard Nixon, 37th President of the United States. All through my political career, I've used red baiting as a tool to attain and increase the power of my political career, which helped make me vice president under Dwight David Eisenhower. I kept writing the Red Scare until 1972, when I began my détente policy with the People's Republic of China and went to Peking and personally met Mao Zedong. And that changed the policy towards China, where eventually we ended formal diplomatic relations to the Republic of China, aka Taiwan.
I'm John Milton Hay. I was the secretary to President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and I became Secretary of State and served under Presidents McKinley and President Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. I was instrumental in formulating the open door policy towards China, which opened China to trade with all the nations of the world. And I coined the phrase to describe the Spanish-American War as that splendid little war.
I want us in our discussion about China to know some facts that are appalling. And that is, we talked earlier about Sun Yat-sen. We will talk about him a little bit going forward. But the fact is that Chinese peasants lived in deplorable conditions. There is the concept of the one pant family. And that is that the Chinese citizens were so poor, many of them, that a family would have one pair of pants that was shared by the entire family, so that when the father or the man of the house went out, he got to wear the pants. And when the female of the house wanted to go out, the matriarch of the house wanted to go out, she would then wear the pants. They had one pair of pants that got shared between the entire family. That's an idea of how poor China was. And that's why we are having this discussion about China from poverty to power, because you have to understand that in less than 120 years, China has progressed to where it is now. And yet, in 1900s, Chinese people were so poor, and it just seemed like like there was no way out of the poverty. And of course, when we talked about Sun Yat-sen and his experience in the West, he had the idea that that China could become China had to emulate and become more westernized in its ways. So I guess President Roosevelt, I'd like to ask you, did you ever, from where you sit, from your historical perch, to be able to look back at during the time of your presidency, and even when you were vice president, did you ever think that China would become what it is today?
No, I never did. But it's a remarkable transition from where they were then to where they are now. What Xi especially, the leader of China today, what they've seen is that, of course, they have a very large country. They have tremendous consumer power with 1.4 billion people. But the other countries of the world, the capitalistic countries of the world, were taking advantage of it. I mean, there was a Starbucks on every corner. There were German cars driving the streets and all over China. And they said, well, why can't we be like that? Just because, and they looked around and they saw the other communist countries like Russia, they weren't exploding economically, and the other autocracies around the world, but they saw the capitalistic countries were. So they adopted a form of capitalism, and they allowed their entrepreneurial brothers to start businesses, and they became extraordinarily successful. And they also gave back, of course, under communism, they owned all of the economy, really, and the farms and whatever. And they gave back the farms to the people so that the people could run the farms and make money off of the farms and support their own people with, of course, the agriculture that they were producing. And they became so successful economically that they had the same problem that we have here in the United States, where there's this tremendous divide between the people, the extraordinarily rich people who own these companies, the CEOs, and the middle class, and the people were getting stiffed. General people were getting stiffed. And now we're trying to figure out how we can even that out by taxation situations, by changing the taxation policy and so forth. Whereas they were able to figure it out, and they had the same problem, of course, in China, and they were able to figure it out because they also have the autocratic principles in place, not the democratic principles, even though they have capitalism. They were able to institute policies that took some of that wealth away from the super wealthy and distributed amongst their people, and they've become unbelievably successful, to the point where when I was president, I mean, if there was any kind of balance of trade, it was certainly in the favor of the United States, because we were supplying materials to the 1 billion people in China. And the situation has completely reversed. They became a producing economy, and they produce goods, that consumer goods and technical goods that are used around the world. And they export way more than they import. And they're able to manufacture enough goods for their people, and the farms are able to produce enough so that they don't have to import all those things that they did before. And they become a very powerful source and a leading country in the world. And they're how they've gone about it by the policy of using capitalism and at the same time an autocratic government may well be what we can look forward to in the world and other countries. So it's something to really look at and study.
One of the things that I find
very successful.
One of the things that I find interesting is how communism in China versus communism in the former Soviet Union and what is now Russia. That the Soviet Union focused on the manufacturing of heavy equipment, of military equipment, when the Chinese entrepreneurs focused on producing consumer goods, which is what you just said, President Roosevelt. They produced shirts so that their workers, they produced shirts that their workers could afford to buy. They weren't producing heavy duty equipment. Their idea was that let's produce things that our people can use, and thereby they have created a class of people, a class of consumers, people who are able to purchase the things that they make in their factories. And consumer electronics, I mean, let's face it, that this world is dependent on China for consumer electronics.
Well,
It's
look
just,
at Apple. Apple is the biggest company in the United States, and yet most of their products are produced in China. I mean, they're manufactured in China.
yes.
So think about it. And they've done that with other companies all around the world, and produce things that people need,
And
their own people need, and that's why they were able to build up their own people as well.
and they were open to foreign investment. They were open to forming partnerships with Western countries, with Western companies, with Western business entities.
Absolutely.
And it may be
Absolutely.
cumbersome to get things done in China, but they welcomed investment. They welcomed foreign investment. And the heavy duty kind of equipment that the Russians were producing was not something that consumers could purchase or would purchase or have an interest in purchasing. And not only that, Russia was very, very closed to outside investment, whereas China, which is the model, as you said, President Roosevelt, that may be the future of the world, China welcomed these outside investments. And now there's this tremendous trade balance, because a lot of the things that we use in this country are manufactured in China.
And I have to say,
the other thing that they've done, if I may, is they've been able to build up China. We've always had this picture of China, that people riding around in rickshaws and living in these little huts and whatever. Well, that's not the case at all. I mean, they took Hong Kong, which of course was an imperialist from imperialist country from the UK, and they saw how successful that was. Well, they took that over right away, and they used that as an example of what they could do for the rest of their people. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, that they at one time were actually purchasing more cement than all the other countries in the world combined. And if you go through there, so you go through Shanghai and Beijing, and you'll see just massive buildings being built all over, skyscrapers, and
a tremendous investment in their infrastructure.
Absolutely.
if I may interject, I'm sorry, if I may interject, it is definitely not the China I dealt with when I met Mao Zedong in '72. China was just come off the devastation of the Cultural Revolution, when the Red Guards, the young people, were just rampaging through the streets, terrorizing party officials, saying that they were on the revisionist, capitalist road, and the country was devastated. I mean, education was at a standstill, business was at a standstill, learning was frowned upon. But now they've made this remarkable recovery and economic dominance under Deng Xiaoping, and it's continuing to this day. That the fact they even have a man in space.
They have you to thank, President Nixon, because if you and Dr. Kissinger had not opened China and recognized mainland China, as we refer to it, they wouldn't have been able to do anything like this. But the fact is, they're going to have their problems too, and part of the problems tie in with us. One thing they do is steal ideas, call it intellectual thievery, and steal different ideas from countries, because there's no protection of patent protections in China. So we have to deal with that. One of the ways they were able to build their economy was to take the ideas developed elsewhere and produce it in their own country. So that's one of the problems we have with them. And of course, they wisely, as Ms. Crawford said, invested in infrastructure, and not only that, they're transporting it throughout the world. They're building roads and highways and apartments in Africa and in different parts
South
of Asia
America.
and South America as well. So they're becoming an imperialistic power in their own right. And so they're the issues that the United States, if I were Secretary of State and these two men were still president, we'd have to grapple with and deal with the problem of intellectual security, patent control, the problem with the South China Sea. And all industrial countries, when you industrialize, you tend to pollute more. And we have climate change that China has to deal with, and the world can't deal with it unless China deals with it because it's such a large country. So we have that issue as well. So,
Well, I
go ahead,
agree
President
100%
Roosevelt.
with you. And yeah, and the thing is that we can't deal with them as we dealt with them in the past as a country that was inferior to us economically. We have to deal with them on the same level as we are, and the administrations have to know that we can't put them down. We have to respect what they've done, and we have to hope that they'll be able to come into the world politic and be peaceful and live up to the standards of what the democratic countries have lived up to now. They have their problems with human rights, but we have our problems too with human rights. So both countries have to deal with them in their own way, but deal with them successfully. But we do have to deal with them on a different level.
Yeah, but I agree with you, President Roosevelt, as I did most of the time. But one of the things that we need to look at as Americans is what happens internally to our country, in our country. Former President Trump had a disdain for the Chinese, even though he had more respect for the North Koreans than he did for the Chinese, and he imposed tariffs that he thought would punish the Chinese. That didn't work. Now, hopefully, President Biden will have a more enlightened attitude toward China. But if in our next elections we return to a right-wing type government who have the same feelings towards China that existed in your time and have carried over to this time, we're going to be in deep trouble with China. And that's what, if I were Secretary of State today, that would will be in trouble with me. If you look at the American history, conservatives have always been quick to put their foot on the neck of the Chinese people.
I agree with you 100%, Secretary.
Yes,
100%.
That's why we were able to work so well together, President Roosevelt.
yes. And
Yeah, I guess it must have been.
but I have to say
good reason.
that, I'm sorry, excuse me, please. I have to say that I don't believe, it's not 100% sure we'll get into a shooting war with China, either about the copyright theft or dominating the South China Sea and the threats to Hong Kong and Taiwan. I mean, many of our large corporations do business in China with hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe over $1 trillion. And they know perfectly well that a war with China would destroy business. And I don't believe Xi Jinping would want to just totally jeopardize what he's built up, and our corporations. I don't believe they want to destroy their investments. So it's not 100% sure that there will be a shooting war. Maybe it'll be an economic war, maybe, but not a shooting war.
Well, I agree with you, President Nixon. But the thing is, you never know. You know, you can look at World War II and World War I, and there were investments in Germany, and we still went to war with them. And as President Roosevelt said before, until we reach a point where we respect China for what they've done and who they are, and not inflict the stereotypical prejudice we have towards them, there's always a possibility that something tragic could happen, and it could lead to a military conflict, especially, if right-wing warmongers are reelected to serve in the government.
I think one of the things that becomes powerfully important to this discussion is something that everyone has basically said, and that is the underestimation of China and why that's not a good thing for us to do. I'm reminded of the old fable of the tortoise and the hare, and viewing the United States and Great Britain as being the hare, you know, running this race and going along based upon speed, which was short-sighted, and the tortoise that just kept plodding along in a steady pace, and did it in such a way that the Western powers were shocked. I mean, I think when they discovered how powerful China was, it was already happening. And I think that one of the things that China was able to do was to do this very quietly, because for a long time, the United States and the West was focused on Russia and the Soviet Union as the enemy. And all while that was going on, China was making deals. China was building infrastructure. China was developing industry that Chinese people could afford to partake in goods and services, and it was autocratic. So, for instance, what we're going through now with the pandemic and the fact that you can't get people to vaccinate, well, that would never happen in China.
We already
that would
said
never happen.
that. Yeah, it wouldn't happen. And that's part of the good, I think. I mean, you know, you hate to say that an autocratic society is really good, but there's certain things that are, I mean, not that getting vaccinated has to be an autocratic situation. I'm not saying that, but yeah, the people listen to the government there, because the government has responded finally to the people's needs, and they've been successful in doing that.
And that's right on the head, President Roosevelt.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's why I was president.
Because
right. I knew those.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No,
but anyway, that's what you have to do. You have to respond to the people's needs, and they've done that in spades. I didn't mean that as a whatever. But they have done that.
But they've done it, and we understand. And you don't want to say they did it in a Trump suit either. But the point of it is, what they have done is they have absolutely. People that were starving and that were hungry are no longer starving and hungry, and they are able to buy goods and live a very good life versus what their foreparents had, and the poverty that their foreparents experienced. That no longer is happening in China. Industry is booming, and guess what? What China makes, the world takes. We're all buying goods from China.
Yeah. But part of the problem is the psychology that built up over the years that they're inferior. So therefore, the fact that they have accomplished so much, we can't accept it. It's almost like the white supremacists can't accept African Americans in the United States achieving business success or intellectual success, because it flies in the face of what their philosophy is towards the rest of the world. So the people that, going back to Professor Burgess, the people that believe that people of color are incapable, so it's hard for them to digest the fact that China has accomplished so much in such a short period of time.
And possibly why they didn't even see it coming. Because do you notice how it appears that, all of a sudden people are talking about China and the power of China and its economic, the fact that it's an economic force that has to be dealt with. Most people are surprised. They exhibit a certain amount of surprise by that.
Exactly.
Well, we've been exposed to propaganda for years,
right,
about what China was, not what they are, but what they were. And we always had that picture of the people in the rickshaw and walking around with barefooted and whatever, an agrarian society. And we were 100% wrong. I mean, over the last 30 years or 35 years, I mean, they changed everything, changed the whole dynamic.
Well,
and been very successful at it.
I'm from a time period, and you gentlemen, of course, from your historical perspectives, have a different view of it. But I'm sure President Nixon will remember. you know, I'm from that time period where we watched Charlie Chan and thought that that's what that was the Chinese people. We, you know, we all bought into that ethnocentrism that the Chinese were these subservient, stupid, slow-witted people who all they could do was show us respect because we deserved respect. And when I say we, I'm talking about the United States politicians that felt like China exhibited respect towards them because that was what was expected, because the Eastern mindset was such that it could never equal the Teutonic Aryan mode of thinking, and therefore it became what this country thought it deserved, what Western powers thought that they deserved. They thought China should treat them with a certain amount of respect. And while the Western powers were busy focused on each other and warring with each other, the Chinese were that tortoise. They just kept moving along and moving along and making deals and taking the best from this and the best from that and coming up with what we now have. And as you said, modern day China is something is a wonder to their infrastructure, their transportation. They've done so much more in the way of achieving a level of comfort for their population.
And to be perfectly frank about it, we shouldn't be surprised, because the Chinese amongst us, and we have a lot of Chinese American citizens. I mean, when you look at the score, you know, at their scores in colleges, I mean, the Chinese students are way ahead of the American students, regardless of what their background was. So, and by the way, at the universities here, how many foreign Chinese are at the universities? University of Pennsylvania in the graduate program has a tremendous amount of Chinese nationalists who are participating in that program. So they're extremely smart. I mean, the fact that we believed that, you know, a long time ago when I was around, that they weren't that smart and weren't capable of doing the things that white people were capable of doing was just wrong. And now I think we have to accept that and deal with it for what it is, and deal with it at our level and their level.
Yes.
And I think we can be successful that way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, and from my perspective, wherever I am, we have to deal with China the way it is. No stereotypes, no preconceived notions, just deal with the Chinese as they are, and give up the idea of the images I remembered, like I've said, about the Red Guards rampaging through the streets. I mean, that is not China anymore.
Well, I think we've pretty much, from going back to Sun Yat-sen and up to the presidency of McKinley, and then the later presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, and on through Richard Nixon, we have had a full-throated discussion of China and its rise, and it's continuing to rise as we speak.